just a touch behind. We're letting people get settled in. Looks like numbers are climbing here. So welcome, everyone. We have such a special event today, and I'm so glad you could be here. Our next two speakers are two just amazing thought leaders in the field of couples therapy, relationships, autonomy, independence, and most importantly, this concept of the mental load. Dr. Tracy Dalgleish is a clinical psychologist and new author of the book, I Didn't Sign Up for This. And, Eve Rodsky, is the New York Times bestselling author of the Fair Play and Finding Your Unicorn Space. And they are here today to talk with us about the mental load and redistributing labor, the invisible labor of households, and how this affects couples and people in relationships. So if you're working with people, and I assume you're working with people who are in relationships. And so if you're working with people who are single, coupled, uncoupled, it doesn't matter. Everyone has different relationships, and the content that we're going to see today with these two experts is just amazing. So welcome, Eve and Tracy. Thank you so much for being here with us. It looks like we're topping out about 1,500 people so far and climbing. So welcome. Thank you for being here with us. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, Eve. Nice to see you today.
Good to see you. Congratulations on your book launch.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I'm glad you've got the copy in hands there. We are going to have a great session today. And this is something that I know you and I are both really passionate around in terms of helping people, helping couples, and now also ensuring couples therapists as well can help their clients come into dealing with the mental load, the invisible and visible labor. So we're going to have a great conversation. And thank you to everyone for joining us here. I want to put on a bit of a framework here first before we move forward. So the goal today is to be able to understand what the mental load is, what this looks like, and the challenges that couples are bringing into your therapy room. And the piece on this as well is to be able to have some tools that you can start using with the couples in your room. And I even want to make this a bit broader, because what we know is the mental load isn't just within couples, it's also within individuals in family systems, where we know that one person in the family might be the one doing all of the gathering and all of the event planning, or even the mental load showing up at work. That's one piece. But there's another piece in here that I want to share with everybody here with us today that I think is so important to contextualize. When I started my training in 2006 in my PhD, we did not have a system in place to address the labor that was occurring in the home. And we were learning the evidence-based tools and skills to be able to support the couple in the room. And so by the time I became licensed in 2013, again, I was training in emotionally focused couples therapy, learning, that's primarily where my background comes from, but also working within systems theory, looking at Gottman interventions. But again, there wasn't a strategy to support couples to then deal with, how do we find this thing called equal division or fair? What does this look like? And so then 2019, Eve, your book came out, Fair Play. You've since developed a fantastic card set. And I have found that, okay, once we get to stage 3 in EFT, couples are feeling secure. They're able to stop that negative cycle that's showing up. And now I feel like I finally have a system to help couples through this. So that being said, thank you so much, Eve, for this work. And I know that we can integrate this into our couples therapy work as well.
Well, I'm very excited to be here with you, Tracy. And I think just to give a little bit of background about also my expertise, as most of you know, I am not a trained therapist. I'm a lawyer. And in fact, my law background, there's about 5 of us in the country who do the type of practice I do. I train families through organizational management and family systems to take over highly complex organizations, family foundations, and family businesses. And so I had done that for about a decade before I started to develop the fair play system for myself, which we'll talk about. But that's my background. I look at the world as a lawyer would through a behavior design lens, meaning lawyers are the ones who design behaviors for society. As you know, if we don't want people to vote in Georgia, we're going to pass a law so that they can make it harder for them to vote. If we want people to stop at a stop sign, we're going to make it hard. We're going to pass a law that people need to stop at that stop sign. So I look at systems and behavior design, and then combined with Tracy's work and all of your work, it's been this perfect storm of, I'd say, a perfect rainbow of beauty in terms of combining our tool set to bring relief on the individual level, and also for you to know that your work on the individual level is helping all of us be cultural warriors so that we can now step out and then do that work to help families on the policy level, whether it's paid leave, family responsibilities, discrimination, access to daycare, other policies that we need to make this this country more hospitable and I'm talking about America, hospitable to working families. But I wanted to give that background so that you know how my work complements Tracy's work.
Thank you, Eve. Just briefly, where are we going today? We're going to have a good conversation around what the mental load is, why it's so critical for us to address it, and some of those common barriers that we both see in our work. We're going to jump into what the fair play method is, talking about this system, and then we're going to do some application of fair play and setting our clients up for success. Before I go forward even further, I'm going to ask everybody here to really step into putting on one hat and making sure we take off another hat. So I want us here, when we're doing any sort of training, any kind of work, of course, there's always something that resonates so deeply within ourselves. We are humans. We cannot take our humanness out of the work that we do. We also experience many of the same things that our clients experience. And so sometimes when we're tackling some of these big issues, it can feel almost personal in a way, and we start to think of our own relationships and what's happening in the home. Today, I'm going to invite you to take your personal hat off and make sure we're putting on our clinical hat. And even before we start moving in, I want you to think of that one couple or maybe the individual who's in your therapy room who is telling you, I have to do it all. This feels so unfair. I asked my partner to help. They're not there. I want you to hold them in mind throughout our session today as we talk more about what this work looks like. And of course, I just want to talk briefly about the limitations so that this content is grounded in the concepts of systems theory, emotionally focused couples therapy, and attachment theory. And the fair play method, Eve, I know you're doing research right now, has not been studied over time across settings, but I know you're working on this work right now. And then when practiced by a trained clinician, also too, knowing that the benefits here are going to outweigh any potential risk or harm to your client. Okay, Eve, let's jump in first. Let's start with some definitions. What is the mental load? What are we talking about when we say mental load, labor, all of those things?
And then also, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A and also in the chat. We want this to be interactive, and we'd like to answer questions as they go, so you're not left wondering. And Tracy, I'll assume that you'll help me with some of the slides.
We will do this together. Yes.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the mental load. You can go probably to the next. I don't know if the next slide has mental load stuff on it. Let's see. No, not yet. Okay.
Nope, I've left it here.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, but the next slide is great too. So let's stay here for a minute. The mental load. Why is it? What is it, and why is it so crucial to address? Well, I think if you want to really think about sociology and also psychology coming together, the mental load is actually a concept that came out of psychology. The idea that when you're stressed, you start to see it come up in other areas of your body. It expresses in your body. But the mental load, as we're talking about it today, is been very gender specific. We now know, and this is something that has been talked about since the Industrial Revolution started, that women have been historically shouldering about 2/3 or more of what it takes to run a home and family. So that is a statistic I was undeniably living. And that's why all research is ultimately probably me search, as some people joke. But this started for me in my own family, where I had what I call the blueberries breakdown, based on my husband, Seth, sending me a text that said, "I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries." And I'll have you all sort of picture the scene, because I think it's very similar to what a lot of your clients are going through. While Seth, my husband, was sending me, "I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries" text, the context for the breakdown I had over that text was that he was sending it to me when I was racing to get a toddler from a toddler transition program that in America lasts about 1 hour, since we don't have access to free daycare solutions. When he sent me that text, I had a breast pump and a diaper bag in the passenger seat of my car. I had gifts for a newborn baby to return in the backseat of the car. I had a client contract on my lap because I was trying to go back to work and negotiate a return to work. And that chaos led me to an emotional breakdown on the side of the road, Tracy, where I started to sob. And this was, again, 10 years ago, when I still blame myself that I couldn't do it all. And I should be, that word should, right? I should be the fulfiller of Seth's smoothie needs, on top of figuring out how to do everything else. And I think it's important to understand that context, because the mental load is actually incredibly isolating. And what I mean by that is you can feel real emotional abandonment. So when I was having the breakdown, which again manifested itself as I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries, in that moment, and again, this was in 2011 when I just had my second son, and many people, I would say, in our Fair Play research do start experiencing this mental load breakdown around after their second child is born, because we can sort of hold it together with one child. If a second child comes into the relationship, or God forbid, an illness or other type of wild card we talk about, then people are entering care when emotion is high, cognition is low. And so this comes about. But why I say it's isolating is because typically the mental load falls on women in 3 areas. And this is what happened to me. One, it falls on us in terms of, as I said, we do 2/3 or more women, especially when we're married to men. But this system is not prescriptive. It could work for clients who have roommates, and we'll talk about that. It's a system that could work for single mothers with their children. We've now seen it. We've been studying it with USC. As Tracy said, we don't have our outcomes yet, but they're looking very positive. So we're very excited about that. But the 3 ways that the mental load can manifest: one, it happens in the workplace. So especially as you're trying to negotiate your way back into the workplace, or your clients maybe, we often get that discrimination. So my mental load was, how do I make myself palatable back to my employer? So I was thinking about that when I had this breakdown. I was begging them to let me work from home for a day, asking them where I was going to be able to pump breast milk. And they told me it would be a converted broom closet that didn't have a power outlet, but if I could bring my power pack, I could go in there with a chair. So we're trying to be palatable to employers. And that can feel very isolating and stressful, so much so that at that time I had quit my job. I now say I was forced out. It also comes up in terms of our relationships, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly today, where sadly, the assumptions around who does domestic work is not related just on money. So this problem is not going to fix itself. As women become primary earners, we see that they actually do more domestic labor. So we're relying on you to break these cycles and patterns, because they're not going to be broken themselves based on monetary gains by women. And so our partners will assume, because of our gender, that we, as one woman, Tracy said to me, my partner thinks I have a magical vagina that tells me, whispers in my ear and tells me what my mother-in-law wants for Christmas. So that is the assumptions that are coming out because of our gender. And then the third way the mental load comes out is our communities. So in the Fair Play research, I called 50 schools and I asked them across America why they call women first And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss the historical reasons why all this happens. But I will tell you that that mental load of managing our communities and the community's expectations is there as well. So it often shows up in our community expectations, our partners' assumptions and expectations, and our workplaces' assumptions and expectations.
I think it's so important for us to understand how it just shows up in all of these different contexts, that it's not something that's just happening at home, but it's also the societal expectations that we see outside of that. And just to give that research number behind this as well, and I know you talk about this in Fair Play, is that women, the research is showing that women are working 90 hours or more of both paid and unpaid labor each week, 90 hours.
And more than that, if you look at it just from a minimum wage perspective, which is not even opportunity cost, women shoulder $1.9 trillion of unpaid labor a year. So this is a pretty major issue that has been, I think, let's just call it swept under the rug. As you said, Tracy, one of the things that was really disturbing to me when I went to therapy about this with my partner was when I asked my therapist, had they been trained on the mental load? Had they read Arlene Kaplan Daniels' historic article about invisible work falling on women, or even Arlie Hochchild's The Second Shift? Our therapist just gave me sort of dead eyes and said, no, that is not relevant. That's sociology. It's not psychology. So I felt sort of gaslit in that I didn't feel supported in that therapeutic relationship because this person didn't have any context for the pain that I was going through at the time.
I want to emphasize this piece here too, which is why this session together from both of our perspectives is so important, because these are the conversations that people are coming into sessions with now. More and more of my clients in the past 5 years compared to 10 years ago are now coming in saying, I am shouldering the mental load. And for many people, their partners are saying, I don't know what that is. And for us as therapists to be informed about what this actually means and what it looks like, I want to add to that. And Eve, go ahead and add as well. But when we talk about the mental load, we're talking about both invisible, visible labor. There's all of these different terms: visible labor, invisible labor, and then the cognitive labor as well that comes with that. So the mental load isn't just about who's doing drop off. And I know we'll talk more about this when we talk about the system, but it's not just about who makes the lunches. It's about all of the other steps and tasks and planning and the mental work that has to go in to get to the actual place of making the lunch or dropping the kids off at school.
Yeah, well, I think the beauty of this session is it's a long session. So again, if you can't stay for the whole thing, we totally understand. Your time is valuable and it's going to be recorded. And also, hopefully somebody at PESI, I believe, is going to be monitoring the Q&A so that we can absolutely answer all of your questions. But I think it's really important to set the stage. What we're trying to do now is set the stage for why people don't come to the table before we give you the solutions for what happens when you're at the table.
Right.
So just, again, I want to give a little bit of context setting to my own experience. And then, of course, we'll go into a lot of the data and I'll give data along the way. But I think what's really important to understand is that most people who come to this issue, similar to the way I did, is that they are told to make a list. And so that was what I was told, right? That I can make a list, bring it to my partner, and then we would discuss that. Well, women have been making lists, for about, I'd say 100 years. That doesn't work. I started with a list, and that list was called the Should I Do spreadsheet. Fair Play. Remember, Tracy, I did not set out to be an expert on the gender division of labor. That was definitely not on my third grade. What do you want to be when you grow up board? It definitely wasn't what I said to Elizabeth Warren when she asked what we want to do with our law degree, where I said I was going to smash glass ceilings by being president of the United States. And then you cut to me 10 years later, right? And the only thing, as I said to you, I was smashing was peas for my toddler, Zach. But I think it's really important to understand the context setting that we often are told to make a list. So I made that list. I made the best list and that's turned into Fair Play. But I will tell you, I made the best list that's ever been made because in 10 years, no one has said to me, you've forgotten something on that list. Fair Play started as the Should I Do spreadsheet. It was a spreadsheet I started to make. And then remember, this is 2012, 2011. I didn't have Zoom. I didn't have therapists who understood the mental load at that point. This was sort of an invisible issue. And so when I made that Should I Do spreadsheet, I sent that to Seth. And ironically, it was the first time since I'd had kids, I didn't feel alone, Tracy, because I included the US Census of women, basically. And then that list ended up being added to by 17 countries, women and men and all genders in 17 countries. But the list, the Should I Do spreadsheet ended up with 98 tabs on Excel and 2,000 items of invisible work. And the reason why I tell you about that list, because it was actually very important to ultimately developing the Fair Play system. I thought that list was going to be everything. Once I did a 9-month project of compiling everything I did that was invisible to Seth, based on the research of invisible work, that articles I was telling you about, that women shoulder the invisible work, and I figured that out. I made this list. I send Seth this spreadsheet that was about 17,000 megabytes or whatever, with just the caption, "Can't wait to discuss," because that's before I knew communication mattered. But I sent him that spreadsheet, and I got back just the monkey emoji, a pixelated early version of that monkey emoji where the monkey was covering its eyes. I had a really important realization about this idea of just making a list, which is that not only do lists alone not work, but I was so frustrated and fed up because what else could I do? I spent 9 months compiling everything I did for the family that I wanted Seth to talk to me about, and he was unwilling and able to engage with the material. And so at that point, really, the Eat, Pray, Love was very popular. So I could eat, pray, love it out of my marriage. The women that were doing really well around me were divorced. They had custody 1 week on, 1 week off. And that the weeks they had off, they were feeling very empowered to work and to get their self-care in. But really what I decided to do, because I wanted to stay married to Seth, was, and that's a privileged narrative, Eat, Pray, Love, was I decided to become my own client. And what's important to understand is that when you work in organizational management, what I'd been telling my clients for a decade before I came to Fair Play was that successful organizations have 3 things. They have boundaries, they have systems, and they have communication. So you can all guess out there what I started with first, obviously. I started with the system, and we'll get there. But I think the most important thing that I can tell you before we're going to get into the details is that became the most important question I asked myself. When I understood that a successful organization is made up of boundary systems and communication, all I had to do was make the connection that my home was an organization. My home was an organization. And so my home also needed boundaries, systems, and communication. And that aha moment, Tracy, changed my life. Because then I actually knew I would have tools to develop that could help people if we looked at homes as our organizations. Or as one man said to me, his home is one where he ironically is a systems designer for a big tech company. And he said his home was one where not only do they have no systems, but they wait to decide who's taking the dog out, right, when it's about to take a pee on the rug every single day. So the opposite of a system is decision fatigue. So that was the beginning for me of understanding what was happening. Now, I want to explain one more thing about the data, which I don't typically go into so deeply, but because we're all academics here and we've been trained and have graduate degrees, I want to explain that once I had the Should I Do spreadsheet, I realized there was no data out there about who does what in the home, whether it was gendered, whether it changed based on an ADHD diagnosis or somebody being sick. I didn't really have there was no data out there about who was holding which household tasks. So when I went to ask people, what does your home organization look like? Most people would say to me, I would pick a tab of the Excel spreadsheet. So I'd say, Tracy, in your home, who handles groceries? Mm-hmm. For most of those 98 tabs, I would hear back from the couple, we both do. Now, that was very hard for me because we know men overreport what they do, women underreport. And so I wasn't getting accurate data. So what I want to end on this slide is the second most important question I've ever asked in this work, besides, is your home an organization, which it is. And that question was moving to get data. It went from who handles groceries in your house to how does mustard get in your refrigerator? And I asked that question in 17 countries because condiments are popular. And this is what was so fascinating and gave me goosebumps. Even in the Nordic countries, in every single country where I asked that question, it broke down when women were married to men in the exact same way. Women are the ones noticing their second son, Johnny, likes yellow mustard, not spicy Dijon with his protein, otherwise he won't eat it. That's conception in project management. Women are the ones who monitor the mustard for when it runs low, and they're the ones who get the stakeholder buy-in for what families need on the grocery list. That's planning. We know that from the workplace. And finally, men are the ones who get asked to go to the grocery store for the yellow mustard. They bring home spicy Dijon every freaking time. And then when women were saying to me, well, Eve, how do you want me to trust my partner with my living will? The guy can't even bring home the right type of mustard.
Right.
Ding, ding, ding. I realized that organization had lost the two most important things an organization ever needs, and that is accountability and trust. And so once I went and said, by putting conception, planning, and execution together, we can start to restore accountability and trust. That became the premise of the Fair Play research in 2012, and we've been testing that premise ever since.
I think this is such an important piece when it comes to sitting with our clients as well, as being able to understand what does that trust look like in the relationship, that when there is a breakdown in communication, are we looking at getting stuck in a blame game? Are we getting stuck in those negative cycles? And how then are we coming back to each having that responsibility and ownership within the home?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think, again, we're in the part of the talk here about why people don't come to the table.
Yes.
So I think I would love to address that in a sociological perspective. And then, Tracy, I know you're going to talk about it from a communications perspective. But if you think of the successful formula, again, of a home organization or any organization as boundaries, systems, and communication, the systems were the easy part for me. As I said, once I realized from the data that the both trap, I looked at it like a brake, Tracy, in a foot, right? That the foot was broken, and the way it was breaking was because women were holding the conception and planning, and men were holding, on average, the execution, if they did anything. And that breakup of this conception, planning, and execution was the issue. You can start mending it. That's the system. And in fact, in lesbian couples, there was another both trap break that often showed up as they both were handling things because of the gender expectations. So I would see in lesbian couples that both people were filling out forms and then getting called from the school saying, you guys filled out the form differently and you have to start over. And so there was other types of inefficiency, especially for lesbian couples.
Mm-hmm.
But really the point is ownership, that when you're holding a task, you're holding it with conception, planning, and execution. That became the baseline for the system. But we're going to go into the system in hour 2, and also how it could work for different types of family scenarios, because not everybody has 2 parents or 2 functioning individuals in the home, right? People have medical issues, they have mental health issues, they have their jobs as pilots. So we'll talk about how that data sort of plays out. But even before we get to the system, which works for all those types of couples, the boundaries and communication have to be unpacked for why people don't come to the table. Mm-hmm. So the most important thing I could say to all of you is that there is male resistance to this topic. And there was a lot of resistance before Fair Play became a love letter to men. And I think that resistance is just because, as we know, people are afraid of the unknown. I know you see that in therapy all the time, right? People are willing to stay in toxic relationships, toxic jobs, because the idea of being a game changer in your own life is scary to people. So homeostasis is very powerful. But these are the things that actually were most surprising to me. Men's reactions were not as surprising. The most common male reactions to resistance were, one, well, if my wife is so overwhelmed, why can't she just receive help? So that was a man deflecting, saying, I will hire a Black and brown woman to support my wife so that I don't have to do this work. Okay, that doesn't work, because you'll find out in the fair play system, there are 100 cards. It's a metaphorical card game. Even if you did outsource, there are still 50 cards that in 17 countries, data has shown us are not outsourceable. So that doesn't work. The other thing I heard from men was, my wife focuses on so many unnecessary things. She cares so much more about X, Y, and Z. So why should I have to work to her standards? The other thing I heard from men was, well, I make so much more money than her. And so why, again, just looking at work as paid work, not that work in the home is valuable. So we would hear things like, well, I work, she doesn't, which is just ridiculous, because we know work in the home is 24 hours, and work for pay, you get breaks, you get to take your job elsewhere, you get to leave the marriage with financial assets. So work is work, unpaid work is work. So we would hear from men, I work and she doesn't, which, we can't. That is just a paradigm we have to dismantle. But the hardest thing for me, Tracy, was watching what I call, and I started, again, writing down certain research notes so I could find the patterns. And this was my most common research note. And this says,
hold it closer.
Yes, it says CIYOO.
Mm-hmm.
And that note means complicit in your own oppression. And what was most alarming to me was that it was often women. It was men approaching me saying that they wanted a system for their home, but that they were afraid to bring it to their partners, because the women were saying things like, in the time it takes me to tell Bob what to do, I should do it myself. Women were saying things like, I'm just a better multitasker. I'm wired differently for care. Mm-hmm. Women were saying things like, I should do more at home because my partner makes more money than me. Mm-hmm. My favorite was, yes, we're both colorectal surgeons, but my partner is better at focusing on one task at a time, and I can find the time. So this idea that women can find time, right? We're not Albert Einstein. We can't really mess with the space-time continuum. But there's just, Tracy, such a different expectation in society over how women are supposed to use our time, that we become conditioned to believe that. So if we go forward in this training, believing that women's time is infinite like sand, and men's time is finite like diamonds, then we're going to unfortunately continue these cycles. So that's really important from a boundaries perspective that I need therapists to help me with, which is unraveling these really complicit in your own oppression, toxic time messages that women have heard and we've given to ourselves, because there is no difference in how women and men multitask. I've gone to over a dozen neuroscientists who say task switching is bad for everybody.
We know that in the research.
We'll talk about that. In the time it takes me to tell him, her what to do, for that, I went to behavioral economists and economists who say that's a present value problem. Of course, you don't want to do laundry for 12,000 hours in the future. You can teach somebody to do laundry now, and that saves you all those future hours, but that's a present value problem. And so we can really start to unpack why women hold these messages. I held those messages for myself as well. So when we can realize, and I want to just say one more thing about time. We see these messages everywhere. I went to health systems. They're still giving out pamphlets that say breastfeeding is free, when it's an 1,800 hour a year job for women. We see an occupational segregation, and this happens at therapists. As women enter fields, salaries automatically come down. So we tell women at all aspects that their time is less valuable than men's time. And so that boundary breaching, when we breach our own boundaries because we don't believe we deserve equal time choice over how we use our day, or we're the ones who assumed would break up our day to pick up a sick kid from school, for example. We do that based on these gendered assumptions. And that's where psychology and sociology intersect, because the system will be fun. We're going to work through the system for you. But getting women to the table requires them doing this individualist work, which is so painful, Tracy. It is so painful to admit to yourself, I'm complicit in my own oppression. It's it's much easier to blame your partner. I'll tell you that. I didn't want to have to look at myself.
Right. And that is that piece of how did we get here in our relationship dynamic? How did we both show up to the table? It's so easy to point to our partners, where couples often show up for couples therapy saying, if you were different, well, if you were different. And that is that common thing that we hear in the therapy room, Eve, which is, the one partner says they never help out. We'll use the word help, even though that's not the word we want to use, but commonly they don't help out. And the other partner says, anything I do, it's not enough. I can't get it right. And so then what's the point? I don't try. And then I up the ante. And then there we go into that negative cycle. So from that clinical
Or there's this negative, really, really toxic view of outsourcing, as I was saying to you earlier, which is, historically this idea that men won't get involved in the home. And typically it had been historically sort of more middle class to upper class, because Black and brown women have been working. They're 80% are the primary breadwinners of their families. So they've been working for pay. They've been dealing with the mental load issues. But especially for white women, there was sort of this white feminism that had said to women over time that you can outsource. We heard that for a decade. And so to move into this care feminism that we need to invite men into their full power in the home so women can step out in the world is an alternate paradigm to just telling clients, which so many people told me therapists were doing, how can you outsource this? How can you get this off your plate? That's not what we're looking at here, because often that outsourcing is, again, to domestic workers who are underpaid, underappreciated. So yes, of course, outsourcing is part of it. But we need to start understanding the dynamic that that's not the be all end all answer. The be all and end all answer is that when you're in a system, whatever that organization looks like, everybody, including kids, come to the table to matter in that system. That's the mattering research that's coming back out. We have to all matter in that system. And so the goal is not to do the work or outsource the work. It's to say, how do we all matter within this system?
Yes, absolutely. You have said this already. I want to put this up here though, for boundaries. All time is created equal. We need to recognize that. We need to understand that. And even just adding to that story, Eve, I know there's a conversation that showed up in my own relationship where it's okay, I can't get all the household cleaning done. And so my husband happily says, hey, let's get a cleaner. And then I'm the one emailing, reaching out, trying to find someone to support us in our home. And again, that's still my time. So outsourcing is not the key solution here. And then I think this is a really key statement that you share with people.
Yes. Well, we can talk a little bit about this boundaries work. Again, we're talking here about how people are not coming to the table. So we did a survey over 1,000 women, and I'll tell you more about that survey later when we talk about communication. But one of the most interesting things about this survey was what roles did women feel like, this was in America. I'll tell you when I'm talking about the 17 countries we interviewed, or when we're America specific, this is America specific. We talked about this idea in our survey. What roles do you feel that you can occupy without guilt and shame? Or what do you feel society wants for you? So what we heard from women, again, in all socioeconomic status, every race, was that women feel that they are entitled to be a partner, that they're entitled to be a parent, and that they're entitled to be a professional for money. If we try to go outside of those three areas and have any interest in our own life, if I want to be an acrobat on the side or I want to sing for fun, we were guilt and shamed into this. And I'll give you an example. A woman, a single mom, was reporting to me about fair play with her son, actually, which was really cute. And she had two kids. She had an older son and a newborn baby that she had in daycare. And she was listening to these messages that she was more than just their parent, partner, and a professional. She was a parent and a professional. And then she said to me, I started to practice piano again. She lives in a rent stabilized apartment near Juilliard. She booked the music room. She went to get sheet music from like Rent or Hamilton. And she sat down and she basically started to practice music. She told me that as soon as the sun started to set, she started to panic from guilt and shame that her toddler or her baby was at daycare, and the toddler does not like to be in daycare when it starts to get dark out. And so she left her sheet music and she went to go pick up her toddler. So we are guilt and shamed, and we'll talk about that, to be parents, partners, and professionals. We are given mom necklaces when we get to the hospital. We don't wear our own initials, which is what I tell women, like how many of you actually wear your own initial around your neck and not just your child or your partner's. But every single thing that we do is reinforced for us to be stuck in those three roles as parents, partners, and professionals. So if you believe that, then you don't need to breach your boundary and say, I need extra time, or my time is equal to my partner's time, because you should be the one to do all the extra unpaid labor. But if you start to believe your time is diamonds and you deserve to be interested in your own life, then things start to change. You become a game changer in your own relationship. And for Seth and me, that's really what the change was, Tracy. It wasn't, okay, I'm going to do more unpaid labor from your should I do spreadsheet, even though that's ultimately what happened by entering the fair play system. What it started as was my own realization that my time is worth something. And so I had to say to Seth, I noticed you have 3 hours after our kids go to bed to check Sports Center scores, to work out, to finish a PowerPoint deck. But I'm doing work in service of our home till my head hits the pillow. And in fact, my head's hitting the pillow 2 hours after you go to bed. And that's fundamentally unfair. And I'm not going to live like that anymore. I value our relationship, but I'm not going to live like that anymore. Mm-hmm. And that was a very, very, very difficult conversation for me to have. And I wish I had had a therapist who could have supported me in that type of conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's so important to be able to understand that piece in there of how important it is to look at our own identity, and how when we nurture the identity within ourselves, it then comes into the relationship, into our relationship with all people. But when we lose ourselves, then we're not there. I know you talk about the research too around when children reach age 10 and how mothers wake up feeling like they've lost themselves and they don't know who they are. One of the things I talk about with my clients I think is so important is that bigger picture of intimacy, because a lot of people will come to our therapy room saying, just give me the list, tell me what to do. I'm more than happy to help. Or particularly when couples come in saying, we have differences in desire. And one of the things that's so important is to frame it for couples as intimacy being a bigger picture outside of, and I know we're not doing a sex specific session, which could be a completely different topic, but I like to inform couples around how when we look at levels of emotional connection, physical connection, how the mental load is divided between partners, then we can start to look at how that impacts our desire and arousal. And we know that for heterosexual couples, we know for women specifically that they start at a sexually neutral place. And when those factors are being nurtured in a way that doesn't feel like we have a bag of bricks on us, then we are more likely to feel aroused when our partner comes to us and says, I'd love to be close with you tonight. And so sometimes framing this too for couples of being able to say, this isn't just about who's doing what task. It's about what your identity is, nurturing your own identity, because then that also feeds into intimacy on a big level in a big picture. Okay, let's talk about communication, because this is another big piece around this. And I do apologize because my voice is leaving me this week. But Eve, you have said that, oftentimes people show up to the table saying that this is a transaction. And actually, we know from systems theory that our communication is really about it being relational. And one of the things that we look for is that the cycles and the dynamics that couples show up with in our office, we can look at it from that perspective where couples come in being fused together, where one partner says, I need more support and help in the home here. And the other one says, so you're saying I'm never doing enough. Then actually that loses the self-other and the two different people and the two different experiences that are showing up in that moment. So what does it look like to understand the communication with the couple in front of us? So it does look like trying to understand these negative cycles that couples get stuck in, and that we know that over time, with the increase of unresolved negative events, these arguments and disagreements, we continue to have more negative affect within the dynamic between both partners. And then over time, they stop meeting each other's needs. And so as part of what stops couples from being able to address the mental load is these negative communication patterns. We get into criticism, which sounds like you never, you always. And it's an attack on someone's character instead of being able to talk about what it is that we need and how we need a different system in the home. Defensiveness shows up, contempt and stonewalling. Those communication patterns, of course, we know the work from doctors Julie and John Gottman, that they are shown to predict divorce in the long run for couples. And so then when we're stuck in these cycles, then it makes it impossible to then be able to communicate effectively or to even find a solution that's going to work for the couple in your office. And then what we see over time is that couples then get stuck into these self-reinforcing negative relationship cycles. And we can look for this with the couple within our therapy room in terms of what cycle they are getting stuck in. Are they in the find the bad guy, which is the blame game? They're one-upping each other. One partner says, and again, Eve, I think this is why your system is so important, is because couples can easily come in and say, well, I made dinner last night and you didn't even do the dishes. Well, I was putting the baby to bed. And then the other partner says, yeah, and I was picking up all the bath toys after you. And so away we go. So finding the bad guy, it's upping the ante. And we're going to stay stuck in that cycle when underneath that, which is what we want to be looking for, underneath that, partners are trying to find the way of saying, do you hear me? Do you understand what my reality is in this and how difficult this is for me? The second common cycle is the polka dance. That's the pursue, defend, the pursue, withdraw. It's one of the most common cycles that we see in our therapy room. And that is where one person is reaching for connection, but they do it through blame and criticism. And the other person in response to that gets defensive, or they shut down and withdraw. And underneath that cycle, one partner is saying, do you see me? Do you see all that I'm doing? Do you see the reality of my load and how heavy things are? And I'm trying my best and I'm so overwhelmed and burnt out. And the other partner says, so you're saying I'm not doing enough. It's never good enough. You're a nag. I can't get this right. And away we go into that negative cycle. And that last one, the last one is the freeze and flee. And this is the couple that shows up into the office where they say, no, we don't really fight. They're both withdrawn. Sometimes partners get to this cycle because once a pursuer, they have now burnt out and they have shut down. They say they no longer fight, but underneath that, there's a lot of anxiety and fear around where they're moving forward in their relationship. Just going to grab some water here. Did you want to add anything to the communication piece, Eve, while I'm taking some water?
Well, I think while you take water, I'll just say back to that survey, because I wanted to bring up that 1,000-person survey we did that I spoke about earlier. A fun thing in that survey was we asked people, what is their most important practice? And, a couple of people didn't understand the question. I like open-ended questions. But most people came up with a religious practice or a meditation practice or an exercise practice. Not one of the 1,000 people, and I was looking for this, I was hoping no one said it as I could use this great statistic. Not one of the 1,000 people said communication was their most important practice. And so as a mediator, I come to this looking at same way, relational communication. As a lawyer, I look at it as, are you coming to the table in a conversation because I need to tell Tracy to go put the damn garbage liner back in? How fucking hard is it to put the damn garbage liner back in the damn garbage can? Or so am I coming to Tracy to tell her something transactional? Or am I coming to the conversation, again, as a mediator, looking at it, I'm here having a conversation with Tracy, not to tell her something transactionally. I'm here at this conversation with Tracy to get better at conversating with Tracy. That's, to me, the difference between relational and transactional communication. When people can come to the table saying, in this conversation with Seth, not to tell him something, but to get better at communicating with Seth. And so when we do that, I think the thing that really unlocked people coming to the table from a fair play perspective, Tracy, in our beta testing, was the idea that we weren't asking them to begin a conversation. We were asking them to shift a conversation. Once couples understood, like one COO who is super powerful said, I do not talk about domestic life. I tried. It doesn't work. I just do it myself. It's easier. Then 20 minutes later, Tracy, she told me that when her partner forgets to put the laundry in the dryer, she's been taking the wet clothes and dumping it on his pillow. There was a woman in a Facebook group during COVID called The Reasons I Hate My Partner and Kids During COVID. She posted in the group, if my partner dies, this is true, actually happened. If my partner dies during COVID, it will not be because of the disease, it will be because of me. So I reached out to her on DM and said, hey, I'm a researcher. Someone alerted me to your post. I want to know how you talk to about domestic life with your partner. Do you know what she said to me, Tracy? She said, I don't communicate about domestic life. This is my safe space. So I just want to reflect on that. Publicly threatening to harm her partner in front of 27,000 strangers feels safer to her than communicating directly with her partner. We have to change that. So I think by looking at this as a communication shift to say, you are already communicating. I'm your therapist. I can go onto your Nest Cam tonight. I'll see 5 ways you're communicating about domestic life without having to even hear what you say. We're in this room asking for a communication shift, not a communication start. And also when you do that, the beauty of the shift is a shift from the transactional one-off. I talked about this in 2005. It should have been resolved, to understanding that communication is just like exercise. If I came to you as my doctor, Tracy, and said, I'm physically fit, and the doctor said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, I exercised once in 2005. A lot of people are doing the same with their communication practice. I had a conversation in 2005 about domestic life and it didn't work. So then they give up. If you look at it as a practice like exercise, I'm not going to give up. I know exercise is important. What I will say is after COVID, a 10-second walk was really, really hard. Now it's a lot easier because I've been practicing. So I think if we can start to move from communication as a transactional one-off to it's a practice like exercise, it's something that needs to be practiced. It's your most important practice. I saw a lot of breakthrough in couples being willing to come to the table.
Yeah, I think that is so important, is being able to reframe that for them rather than getting stuck within it. And again, that one-off piece, I know I commonly hear that from my couples, also from my individuals, in the sense that I brought it up once, I'm not going to bring it up again. And actually, I think even within the emotion focused world, what's also really important to understand is that if a couple is high conflict in front of us, it's really hard to then be able to problem solve anything. And that we want to be able to shift, how are we actually doing that in session with the couple? And then one of that ways, I love that you have framed it that way, is we are changing this. And then within the EFT world, one of the ways I do that is really looking at how to de-escalate that conflict within stopping that cycle, with naming the cycle that the couple gets into. What is this cycle? Can you stop the cycle? Can you step out of it so that we can then move into having a different conversation? Otherwise, we'll just keep spinning around into that cycle. And then also too, how powerful it is in therapy for you as the therapist being able to label that cycle for the couple and framing the mental load item. So when I'm coming to you in this way, that actually what I'm looking for is for that connection conversation for us to show up to the table together. Yeah, I think that's great. I know for our time, I'm going to move forward, Eve, because I want to also make sure we get to questions. So I did put this in here. So this is from the emotionally focused couples therapy. If you are not using the negative interaction cycle, it's such a good tool to be able to have so that you can break down what's happening for partners in front of you. And you can frame this within when I come to you to have a conversation about all of the tasks in the home, this is what starts to happen. What is the behavior that you see happening? So what is it that you do, or what do you see the other person do? What do you tell yourself inside of your mind? What are those beliefs? And again, Eve, you've mentioned this already, is how we then tend to tell ourselves, it's just easier if I do it myself. I might as well just do it. They don't know how to do it. So we hold all these thoughts and beliefs that are going to keep us stuck, and also stuck in the secondary emotions of anger, frustration, and resentment. And that for many couples, they don't end up even starting to look at the core emotions and attachment needs and longings that are sometimes driving our ability to solve our problems. So it is about that connection. It is about feeling seen and important with our partners, that we need to be able to have that within our relationship while also then being able to problem solve moving forward.
Can I just say one thing about EFT is so beautiful with fair play?
Yes.
Because of that second piece, if you go back to that slide for a second, it's the assumptions. So whether, again, you call it gaslighting or sociology or these gendered assumptions, the beautiful thing about EFT is that you can actually incorporate these gendered assumptions we're talking about in fair play that aren't, blaming the couple. They're just what society will assume. Mm-hmm. Back to that magical vagina joke, that that person had said to me. So that's where the assumptions can come in, where you can start breaking that down. Because a lot of the assumptions, like as we said earlier, are gendered assumptions. Yes. And then what I wanted to do just really quickly, for couples who are healthy, who are already working with EFT, this has been fun. A lot of therapists have incorporated, they're in the Fair Play book, but we could always give it to you. Of course, we want you to have as many resources as possible. They have told me that they've used a little bit of humor. That humor is also a great way to start deflecting some of these negative interaction cycles. So I'll just practice with you because we're getting into some of the exercises. But Tracy, let's just do this, the fun sort of fair play version of the tracking the negative interaction cycle. Again, this is for couples who are emotionally healthy, who can handle humor. And so that's just a caveat. So what we'll often do is we will ask, it's like the newlywed game, but the opposite. So Tracy, I will say to you, this is how we play with the couple. I want you to tell me, okay, I won't give your actual partner's name, but let's just call him like John. So yep. we want John, John's there, and we're saying to Tracy, okay, Tracy, I want you to say what you think John would say about you. So this is like the newlywed game. What would John say about you? Picture a fight that you and John had recently, whether it's something over the garbage liner or maybe something bigger, like you want to transfer schools. It could be a small or big time when emotion was high, cognition was low. Would John say, and I'm going to give you 8 choices, that you're one, long-winded, that you're talking, no one's ever listening, and we all tune out. 2, that you issue sharp commands. your drill sergeant delivery isn't popular with the troops, that you use bad timing, that you drop grievances and requests for help in inopportune moments. Oh, thanks for the flowers, honey, but you forgot the dishwashing detergent again. 4, toxic word choice. I wasn't going to say anything, but I really hate it when you, or next time you really need to, whatever. That's sort of one of mine. 5, all or nothing. You never replace the toilet paper roll. You're always leaving the seat up. Oh, there's 7, not 6. I mean, not 8. 6, dredging up the past. This is just like the last time you forgot to. Or 8, avoidance and boiling over. I avoided this conversation. I avoided this conversation. I avoided this conversation. And I wasn't going to say anything, but I didn't say anything. But now I'm incredibly pissed.
Right.
Or as one man said, he calls that the short wick conversation. So if John was talking about you, what would he say about you?
John would say that I used the toxic word choice. I wasn't going to say anything, but next time you really should. Yeah.
And so again, we could go sort of longer into how you can unpack that. But what has been sort of beautiful about having some humor and some reverse newlywed type games is it's nice to interrupt your communication vulnerabilities, because then when you're going through those communication vulnerabilities, then typically maybe you can bring some humor. So Seth now says things to me like, okay, you're using your drill sergeant tone, toxic word choice. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to come back later when emotion is low and cognition is high. So again, it's sort of a fun, practical way to use to interrupt the negative interaction cycle.
I love that you said that. And I want to just reframe that a little bit, because I think my therapist mind had to reframe that. When the emotion is high, cognition is low, that's when we are dysregulated. That's when we have gone from being connected from the front of our brain to the back of our brain to then being offline, outside of our window of tolerance. I see the garbage can again. You didn't put the liner in it. And then I look over at him, and even though he's made dinner and there's a 4-course meal on the table, and I say, how could you not put the garbage liner in there? And I'm angry and not using the front of my brain to be able to breathe and to see how we can communicate and move forward through this. That list there, Eve, I think can be really helpful, because again, the other piece within couple patterns is being able to help them step outside of them and give them playful names, right? Or be able to use humor to get out of it, so that it's not this like you versus me piece, but rather let's be on the same team and view the cycle and the issue outside of us, which so much our couples come into our room saying, if they were different, rather than saying to them, it's so easy to want to point the fingers, but what we're going to do in session is we're going to be shoulder to shoulder and put the problem in front of us. Could we find a name for your cycle to start stepping out of it and to see when that's showing up for you?
And our data scientists, what they found in Fair Play was that I just got a chat from the administrator. I'm supposed to say where those came from. It came from my book, which is called Fair Play. Those humorous examples, but our data scientists for Fair Play found that typically most of those vulnerabilities, communication vulnerabilities in that quiz, when we asked people, were coming from actually giving feedback in the moment. So people would say to us, when I'm most likely to use toxic word choice, to use all or nothing, to use the short wick blowing up on you, it was typically because people would reply to us that they did not feel like they were going to forget, or they were going to not have another time to bring up the issue. And so they felt compelled to give feedback in the moment. We know, again, from mediation, that feedback in the moment is highly toxic, because it often does happen when your emotion is high and your cognition is low. Mm-hmm. So obviously moving couples towards talking about these issues, writing them down and having it in the therapy room to talk about, having check-ins over cookie dough, a glass of wine, short-term reward substitution, we call that in economics. The idea of moving people away from feedback in the moment also interrupts the negative interaction cycle.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Let's keep going. I want
Yes.
to make sure we frame the mental load within the cycle, but I want us to keep going. And just, I think this is worth really, we've talked about this already, but just to pause and really acknowledge that there have been, it can be really easy in the couples therapist seat to sit across, or even if you're working with an individual client, to get stuck in the finding who is right or wrong. And it really is that classic, one partner says you don't do enough, the other partner says I'm trying my best. And as the therapist, you're sitting here saying, okay, somewhere in between there's the truth, right? And that's not for us to decide that, but rather I think this is where fair play really comes into play, which is let's look at this system. Let's build a system so that you can use this, which then pulls in the accountability and trust piece that we want to be able to build within the couple. Did you want to add anything here?
Well, we'll go into how to play fair play. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about what the tool actually looks like.
Yes. And then we've already talked more about the limitations of these strategies, in the sense that when one partner says, just tell me what to do, it leaves you being in the CEO position. Those calendar reminders, again, tend to land on women, and it's not us being able to work through. All right, let's go into the system. I'm going to hand this over to you here.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the system of fair play. And we're going to, I think, break out into some exercises. I wish we could do breakout rooms because
I know, and we don't have
fun.
it here.
Yeah. So we did mustard. So we can go through here. So let's skip a little bit ahead.
Okay, we talked about this already.
We talked about that. Let's keep going. We did that. We did ownership. Yep. Can keep going on. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what fair play is, and we're going to prep you for some of these exercises. So as we said earlier, unfortunately, the system alone is not enough. The boundaries, systems, and communication is the secret formula. So communication is what we started with, because that's often why people aren't coming to the table. The idea of moving from a start to a shift, looking at communication as a practice, interrupting those negative cycles, possibly using humor if you feel like you can, recognizing that especially within the mental load conversations, the toxic word choice, the feedback in the moment it's often happening because people don't feel that they have another time in which to have these conversations, right? So encouraging people to check in even before they start the system, getting a practice of emotion is low, cognition is high conversations, checking in every night for 6 minutes. You can set a timer if your partner's long-winded in that vulnerability quiz, but get people to start having a practice of communicating with each other, at least, if you can, a couple times a week. It's very, very, very helpful. And actually couples with neurodivergence, Tracy, like ADHD, they find the check-in is the only time they can hear these conversations. Yes. When we hear back from people who have ADHD, neurodivergence, that type of neurodivergence in the fair play system, they cannot hear feedback in the moment. It is highly overwhelming. So often the check-in is especially important with somebody who has ADHD. At least that's what we're hearing from couples who have that.
Right. So just adding to that, it's the challenge of task switching, and that when you're having
and the fighting over it and calling out your mistake in the moment adds extra shame and guilt to the person with ADHD, so they cannot hear, their prefrontal cortex shuts off and they can't hear the criticism. They just feel it as an attack.
Right. They can't hear the request. They just hear it as an attack. And that we want to avoid those door handle conversations. This shows up in parenting as well, the parenting feedback. So being able to then save all of that. So you can help your couples make notes on their phone that if there are things that are happening for them, find another strategy to write down what they're struggling with, and then find a different way to bring it to their partner. And again, that's where implementing the weekly meeting is really important for couples who are rarely expressing emotion with each other or having any kind of back and forth. the first piece of homework I give to them is to print out the emotion wheel and just to sit down at the dinner table each night, pointing out what emotion is happening right now so that we can start having these conversations. And those would be particularly for the high conflict couples who are not even able to step into the listener and share a role. That's going to be really important.
100%. And so now that we're entering systems that we understand, and of course, I wish I could tell you more about boundaries, but I think we did at least a decent enough job so you know the toxic time messages when women are complicit in their own oppression, they're bringing to the table. So dismantling this idea that I don't deserve my free time, all that guilt and shame, that is individual work you can do with your client. Obviously, we talked about communication, but now we're really digging into what the system is. Assuming people are at the table and that they're willing and able to engage in these conversations, here we are. And so what happens when people come to the table? Well, let's go into actually what fair play is. So I'm going to show you the actual cards, but it's metaphorical. You can find these free resources at fairplaylife.com. You don't need to use the cards, but I'm going to show you what the deck looks like. So this is the core concepts of fair play. Fair play is a game. It believes that gamifying and putting a problem in front of you for you both to tackle, which again, my dear friend Tracy also agrees with, is easier than playing the blame game or scorekeeping. So when you are holding a card, as we said earlier, the core premise of fair play, if you're doing this well, is that you are holding the card, as we said earlier, with full conception, planning, and execution. So again, let's talk about how that breakup manifests. When Seth and I start to play the game, again, 10 years later, he's probably holding 60 cards. I'm probably holding 30. There are 100 cards in the system. They're divided into 4 suits plus wild cards. So the 4 suits, Tracy, are home, out, caregiving, and magic. The reason I bring that up is because I want to bring back that outsourcing comment that a lot of men say, if you're so overwhelmed, just get help. Again, which has been historically problematic for many different reasons. Those suits are important because the caregiving and the magic suits of the cards are typically ones that are not outsourceable. And so what do I mean by that? Well, cards in that suit are things like medical and healthy living for your children. So as much as you love Alexia, she's probably not deciding whether your child's adenoids are being taken out. As much as you love Alexia, she's not going to be in the IEP meeting advocating for the accommodations you deserve under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so those, even if you could, quote unquote, outsource the cards, there are still 50 cards in the deck that are not outsourceable. The way the deck breaks down, if you were dealing with a couple without children, which I recommend, of course, you start this without children, or even a single parent working with a child, or a roommate situation, you will be playing with 60 cards. If you introduce children into the equation, if someone is about to have a child, you add 40 cards. So that already normalizes what couples are going through. Couple, it's not your fault that your fights have increased, that you feel more depressed or sad, or men are being diagnosed now with postpartum depression at twice the rate. You just added 40 additional labor cards to your deck. Of course, you're going to feel overwhelmed. Of course, things need to change. So those are the 4 suits. And then Tracy, we have 10 cards that are called wild cards. And what those do is they are communication prompts to bring people back to the table. New job, welcoming a child into the home, bankruptcy, job loss. They are a glitch in the matrix where a kid gets sick and you have to bring them home. The wild cards are a trigger to come back to the table to continue to have fair play conversations. So what happens when you are holding a card? Well, what it changes from, and again, this is where Seth and I started, when I was holding all the cards, the goal is not 50-50. I know a lot of feminists get mad at me when I say that, but the goal is really perceived fairness, because there are many studies that show actual fairness is a panacea. Again, it sort of puts the therapist in a weird position. What does it actually mean to be right or wrong? We're looking for perceived fairness between the couple. This is not prescriptive. A lot of perceived fairness in religious couples because of different doctrines. I come from a very black hat Jewish family. A lot of perceived fairness is a different perceived fairness than it would be in necessarily my home or maybe someone else's home. So the goal is to get to perceived fairness. But what you do want is you don't want one person holding all the cards, because that is really unsustainable for one person's mental health. This is too much. And again, if you're a single parent, that's why we're fighting for you to have the government be your partner. But this holding all the cards is highly unsustainable for especially for women. So what we're trying to do is move cards over with full ownership to someone else. So in my house, it started just with one card, Tracy. That was the extracurricular sports card. Seth, God bless him, when we started this game, truly, genuinely thought that taking our kids every Saturday to the soccer field was handling their extracurricular sports. Once he realized, and you can find this on the Fair Play website, we've done this for you. We have broken down every single card into conception, planning, and execution. So what you will see for the extracurricular sports card in the Fair Play deck on the website is you will see conception, which is surveying your kids for what sports they want to play. The planning, asking everybody else in your class what sports they're playing and what leagues are good for your kids. That's harder if you have a neurodivergent kid who wants to play sports. You need extra research. Other planning is to log on to a website where you have to register your child. Oftentimes you need a birth certificate to register your child. Oftentimes you need to be on an 85-person text chain to get your child to and from sports. Oftentimes they need equipment. So you're asking to borrow equipment or to order it on Amazon. Those are the conception and planning tasks that are required just to get your child to the field with maybe a water bottle and sunscreen. So when Seth was taking over his first card, he had to understand, and this is where therapists can really help, that owning a card was more than the execution of showing up, where everyone could pat him on the back and be like, you're such a great dad. It was all those invisible mental load tasks behind the scenes. Once Seth took over the text chains, he said to me, this is the most inefficient thing in the world. I'm on 2 different text chains for 2 different sports. It's taking up all my time. I'm like, yes, Seth. And that's just one card. The beauty of that, Tracy, is even if he had just taken on extracurricular sports, which we realize over time, I get about 6 hours of my week back. To be honest, I probably would have been okay with this. I would have been okay with the perceived fairness of him just holding one card. Over time, it's evolved because he's wanted to, and it's been amazing. But when I was complicit in my own oppression, that getting my 6 hours of my week back, because I didn't have to deal with the mental load of my children's sports, was such a huge relief. That is fair play in a nutshell. It's not rocket science. We found that even the workplace, right? Every workplace, every person who is in their workplace understands you don't hire an employee who comes in and says, hey, what should I be doing today? I'm just going to sit here and wait for you to tell me what to do. Even my Aunt Marion's Mahjong group has clearly defined expectations. You don't bring snack twice to that group, you're out. But the home is our last frontier where we haven't brought any of the organizational mindset of who does what in advance. And that's ultimately what the card deck is helping you do.
I'm going to put on my couples therapist hat because I know for many people that this can sometimes feel like we're having to sit in more of an active role in the therapist chair that we might not be used to doing. And so I do think there is a level of education that therapists need to be providing to the couple, and to not discount how important it is for you in that objective outsider role to help educate both partners about this. And then again, really framing it as this isn't a you problem or a you problem, but this is this piece where society and gender-based roles and all of that have really failed us as couple partners to come to this place. And so now let's look at this system of how we can do this and to really step into a little bit more of that psychoeducational role. If I put the therapist language on it, psychoeducational role of how we're going to do this with our couples. And I think that really important piece here is being able to say to partners, ownership of a task is really important.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Next slide.
So there's this bottom piece here, the minimum standard of care you haven't addressed on yet. And that I know addresses the key question that many of us experience in therapy, which is, but to what level? And because couples will then get into fights where, let's just take, again, a heterosexual couple, the man says, well, I go to make dinner, but then she says I didn't make the right thing for dinner, or she says I don't do enough, or it's whatever it is, pasta again.
Well, again, this was the most interesting part of being able to beta test the system, Tracy, for years before we even brought it into a book, into cards, into these tools. So it turned out that ownership alone was not enough. So I thought the breakthrough was going to be CPE, that when people understood that there is mental load tasks, there's conception and planning behind all the 100 cards, that people would just adopt the system and say, oh my God, thank you. Now I know I'm going to run my home like I run an organization. What we found was that in the workplace, because there's an expectation of pay, people do not come in saying, hey, what should I be doing today? I'll just wait here till you tell me what to do. And in fact, also the person in the role of mentor or supervisor is also not screaming at that person saying you did everything wrong. They sit down, they come up with a performance plan, they give feedback. So that wasn't happening in the home. Ownership was not enough. So we couldn't just move. And this was the biggest breakthrough. If I gave couples the cards, or even a therapist cards to do with the couple, and I said, all right, guys, we're just going to move towards dividing them up. Divide them up with full ownership. Bye. That didn't work. So what we had to do was onboard people the same way you would be onboarded into any system. And the onboarding, most people understand what ownership means. If you go to the conception, planning, execution checklist, if you ask anybody, what would it take to plan a birthday party or to handle our lawn and plants, most people can understand that there are tasks behind the execution. But what was happening, Tracy, was that people were really, really getting stuck on what I now call the minimum standard of care. So what was happening in the research was people were saying, I handed over the extracurricular sports card, Eve, but my partner, and this was a funny story in Fair Play, where a partner handed over the extracurricular sports card and her child got lice because the partner didn't bring the child's helmet. And so they used the communal batting helmet and the child came home with lice. And then this person said, I'm never going to ever trust you again. Back to the all or nothing language. You can never be trusted. My accountability and trust is eroded. So what we realized is, how do you enter the system? The most important thing about entering the system, and what therapists can really help with, is what we're going to do next. We're going to do 2 exercises for you that will allow you to ultimately uncover a couple's minimum standard of care. So again, an example that's an interesting example was garbage. The idea around garbage, you can understand what it means to own garbage. You can say to yourself, garbage is putting the liner back in. Garbage is getting the cans out before trash day, if you have that, or putting it in the incinerator or whatever, the trash outlet in an apartment building. The garbage means putting the little garbages that are in the bathroom into the big garbage to take it out, and also maybe putting little liners in if you like that or not. People can understand what the full ownership cycle is of garbage. But the problem is with minimum standard of care, it often comes down to timeline. When things get done and whether somebody has the accountability and trust to believe the other person will do it. So when Seth and I started on garbage, I was still following him around the kitchen. And he said, you're my garbage shadow. I'm not going to do fair play or try this. It wasn't called fair play back then. Try this system with you if you're going to stalk me about garbage. And so what we had to sit down and take a step back and realize was I had never told him my stories. He had never heard my stories about garbage. We had never sat down and said, hey, let's talk about what it was like to deal with garbage as a child. But in my household, as a latchkey kid of a single mother, garbage was highly triggering because it led to cockroaches and water bugs all over our kitchen. I put a disabled brother to bed alone at night. My mother worked nights. He would ask for water in the kitchen. I would go in, the cockroaches would scatter. I would bring him the water. When I see a banana peel sticking out of the garbage, I feel like I'm that child, that latchkey kid again. And Seth was able to say to me, well, I had a housekeeper growing up. I don't care about garbage. So if you care, then you should do it. Well, that's a very toxic way to look at a relationship. Your job sucks. You should deal with it. I don't care. No, you should care about what your partner cares about. And so this idea that he was not going to take the garbage out every hour, but he said, I do care about garbage because you're telling me you care about garbage. I will own it. I will CPE it. But the minimum standard of care is garbage is going to go out once a day at night before we go to bed. That's the minimum standard of care. And then garbage started to go out, Tracy, every single night. It was literally a miracle. And that was the missing part. What we need therapists to help us with, and mental health professionals and life coaches, is to help people not feel awkward when they start to have conversations around garbage, because we don't value these things. So what I thought it could be fun, I don't know if we're able to pull anybody up or we can model these, but if anybody wants to put things in the chat or
I think that the chat is disabled. So
okay, chat is disabled, but we do have, I think, Q&A. Sorry, it's so busy, our Q&A, and I feel horrible because I hope we can get.
I've got some questions for us to get to, so we'll get to
amazing. So then I think we should do it. Let's model.
Let's do it. Model. Yep.
Okay, so we're gonna model as the couple. You will have been the therapist asking us to do one of these exercises. So let's start with telling our story. Yes, let's pick one. So Tracy, this is how we're going to do it. I just want you, and then please follow along in Q&A, and you can give us your stories too. This is just a sample, right? This is 1, 2, 3. This is 10 of the 100 cards. We just threw together a random sample. You would have your client pick a card, or you could use this prompt and just ask for a story. So Tracy, I think I'm going to ask you, let's pull groceries.
I've got the grocery card with me.
Oh, you did? Okay. So I want to hear everything. I want to hear who got groceries growing up? What grocery store did you go to? Did you look at unit prices? Anything you can remember about groceries growing up?
It's actually, there's a grocery story in my book as well about being a young child wanting cereal and it wasn't in the budget. So the stories I heard around groceries were that my mother could not budget appropriately, that she didn't know how. She only had so much money and then spent over and went home in tears. And my dad took her and helped her to be able to then count what groceries they're spending and how much money. And then growing up, the belief was that if my mother, so that was when they were first married as a couple and they're 20 and 19. But then growing up, the message was, if my father goes grocery shopping, then we only have sweets and sugary cereals in the home. But mom goes and mom knows everything that we need. And she knows exactly how much of whatever condiment it is, when to buy it and when to stock it. So that would be my grocery store story. And as well, at the same time, that messaging was passed on to me that in our relationship, I was the grocery shopper.
What's interesting is even the way you heard those messages, your mother couldn't budget. It wasn't, your father may be more adept at groceries, so I will take over the ownership of that task and get the stakeholder buy-in for what everybody else needs on the list. It was, your mother can't budget. So already we're hearing these blaming messages, right? That the assumption is that she would already have been in charge of groceries. And not only that, but she was failing, she was doing it wrong. And then you also saw, well, actually, no, she was doing it, quote unquote, better because she got you the things you needed. Whereas your father just grabbed certain random things off the shelf and you couldn't put together a dinner for it.
Right.
Why I like to do that. So let's just do one more. Let's do teacher communication. I want to know if you remember anything about parent-teacher conferences. Did you have two parents in the home going? What do you remember about anybody who communicated with your teacher? Did you ever get in trouble? Were you like the gold star student? What do you remember about who was responsible for communicating with your teachers?
It would have been on my mom. I mean, we're just going classics 80s parents here,
Yes.
right? That of the two parent home is that my mother was the one who was called. She would be working and would have to stop her work day to come and pick me up from school if I wasn't feeling well. I would be in the kitchenette at the office while she was trying to finish up her meetings, and I would be watching The Little Mermaid or something. And then she was the one who was in communication with the teachers, and she would also be the one having conversations with me about school.
Well, I love that so much. And the reason why we're doing this, right, is because when the minimum standard of care comes up, similar to the conversation, Tracy, I had with garbage, right? So from your story, without even predicting what the division of labor in your home is now, I would either say Tracy took it on because her mother took it on, or I could predict that you hated grocery shopping. It brought up a trigger for you because your father criticized your mother and you want nothing to do with it. So I can already sort of predict certain minimum standard of care and patterns that come up for couples. And I can always sort of predict if I just hear one story of their childhood, I could sort of predict what their minimum standard of care hurdles will be.
Right.
And often it is that a woman was handling it. And so, especially in the hetero cisgender couples, a lot of men did not have the exposure or the experience with handling they never saw their father handling any of these tasks. Or for me, I'm a parental child. So I was taught to be a partner to my mother. So then, of course, I could do everything, right? So you start to get at people's, I think, patterns, and that helps you later. So that's step one. So let's do the other. So that's the telling your story. That's one way to bring the cards to start getting at the minimum standard of care. You want people to tell their stories around all these cards. It's a very slow onboarding process. It's not the ultimate system, which is ownership of the card, but it allows people to understand where their minimum standard of care hurdles will be. So let's try the build your deck one. Okay, so that one is, we're going to start thinking about how do you build your deck together? Assuming you've done the tell your story or you feel like everyone can have good minimum standard of conversations and there's good faith, then you can start by building your deck. Again, not a scorekeeping exercise. You're not going to go to people saying, you've never done this before, so you're going to take on 20 cards and start tomorrow with full ownership. No, you're going to start really slowly by getting people and the couple aligned with what they value. Again, the most negative toxic time message besides the outsourcing message I heard from men was, my wife does so many unnecessary things. I don't want to engage in this because I don't want to have to pick up unnecessary things. When you build your deck together, you get to realize what is necessary, what is not necessary, what has to be in your deck, what doesn't. So let's do a little bit. We will practice since we can't break out. Let's pretend we are a couple. I'm just going to play with the actual deck. I'm just going to start pulling things out of the deck that are just randomly assigned. So we'll start building our deck together. Again, you can help your couple with this. This often takes multiple sessions. There are 100 cards. You're telling stories. You're getting people comfortable with CPE means, which a lot of people have never heard that term before. They're maybe not familiar with systems or organizational management. They may not know that making decisions in advance will help them with decision fatigue. So you're bringing them slowly into the system. But once you're able to start building their deck. So Tracy, I feel like we're so overwhelmed because we have a newborn. I think we should donate our plants because I'm not sure either. I see one behind you. I'm not sure that either one of us wants to water them this year. Like, do you think we could just like give our plants away so we can take this card out of our deck?
Yeah, if I had a newborn, I would definitely be like saying goodbye to the plants.
All right, so let's take out lawn and plants from our deck. Let's keep going. What about self-care?
Self-care is a non-negotiable.
Okay, so we'll talk about what that means and what we want it to mean for each other. But for now, if you believe it's non-negotiable, I would like to believe it's non-negotiable. So let's keep it in our deck for now. Okay, let's see what we have next. Okay, what about meals, weekday breakfasts?
We need to eat breakfast. It kind of has to be there.
All right, so let's keep that in our deck.
And just circling this back, Eve, because you had said you went through this list. So you have tackled all of the possible things where this is one of those tasks where couples will just take for granted that breakfast shows up on the table for the kids. Yes. Or for each other, right?
And so, but that's a beautiful thing. So is it that you only get like a huge trigger about this card? One of the main triggers for meals, weekday breakfast is especially women will tell me their partners will come into the kitchen, make their own breakfast, whether it's a smoothie or whatever, and walk out and just assume that the woman is going to make breakfast for their kids. So that could be a very highly triggering one. Pets. I never want a pet. I know you want a pet. We can talk about this. Let's bring this back into our deck when our kids are a little older, but I know, thank you for honoring that we're keeping pets off the table for right now. Again, this is a fun one to tell your stories. I didn't grow up with animals. I grew up in a studio apartment on Avenue C and 14th Street. A lot of people, pets were the most important thing in their lives. You get some issues around minimum standard of care or going rogue. I've seen many couples where someone will just bring a pet into the home. That is erosion of accountability and trust. So let's keep pets out. So far we have lawn and plants and pets out of our deck. What about diapering and potty training? Our baby is new, so I know not really doing potty training yet, but
diapering is still part of the load. Yeah.
So diapering, yes, that's in our deck for right now. Birth control.
Okay. Needs to be
that in our deck.
Yeah.
Okay. What about grooming ourselves and buying clothes for ourselves?
Yeah, needs to be part of it.
Again, highly triggering card because many men in my data were expecting their wives to replace their underwear. I would get so many stories of men saying, I don't have a tuxedo or a suit for the wedding, and it's your fault. So grooming and wardrobe is actually a very highly triggering card for a lot of people.
Who buys the deodorant in your family?
Exactly. That's why grooming and wardrobe are two players.
Right.
You can get people to start conditioning themselves to be responsible for their own grooming and wardrobe. What about returns and store credits?
Which one is this one?
The last one. Returns and store credits. Do we care about that? Or should we just, if we get something, not care?
Well, I mean, if we have accidental purchases, then we have to give them away. So if I'm giving them away in the buy nothing group, that's still part of somehow giving them away for something. So we still need that card.
Okay, we'll keep it in. So
that's shopping.
Yeah, that's it. That's the modeling.
So Eva, I think that what that also calls into play with is that oftentimes a lot of couples struggle to identify what their values are. And that sometimes even we have to take that step back to talk about what is really important to you right now and in this season of your life as a couple, as what's going to fill you up and what's meaningful. And so that even is a place to start. And I know a lot of people have a hard time identifying their values. And so sometimes even pulling out a bullseye exercise where you're talking about, what is under the workplace that's really important to you right now? How important is education and training? What kinds of things are important to you around physical and personal development? Or even asking your clients, imagine yourself at your 80th birthday party. What do you, or your 40th anniversary, what do you hope that people will be able to say about you as individuals and as couples? Because that can then help your clients go inwards and say, gosh, in the moment, plants feels really important because I love that little plant there. But at my 80th birthday party, no one is going to say, and Tracy had this really beautiful money plant in her office that day.
And I think, again, back to the tell your story exercise, the caregiving and magic cards, when you're telling stories about your childhood, will allow therapists to unearth people's values. So what I mean by that is cards like tell your stories around holidays. Mm-hmm. What did holidays look like for you growing up? There's a card called birthday celebration, other kids. There's a card called birthday celebration, your kids. Again, you're going to be playing with less cards if they're not children, but there are still 60 cards without children to have conversations with. And sometimes people are only having these conversations for the first time, Tracy, after kids have left the home, where actually their value system was just family and their value system was just friends or family. And then their kids are empty nest or they're empty nesters. And they're saying, wait a second, I've been bearing a lot of these other values that I have. And so I think the beauty of the conversations around some of those magic cards, did you have Santa growing up? What were your holidays like? What were gestures of love that you were given as a kid that you want to continue on? I used to beg my mother to put a note in my lunchbox and she would laugh at me like I have time for that. You pack your own lunch. So, am I overcompensating now, Tracy, by writing a big tome to my kids every day because all I wished for was a lunch, note in my lunchbox? You start to get at these beautiful stories.
Of course. I want to just highlight that piece there that someone's asking about the baby boomers and when couples retire. And I think this is such an important tool that can be used at any season in a couple's life because you are readjusting to what's happening. There is no age limit in terms of when you can start redividing the tasks that are happening in the home. And actually, even retirement is a great chance to look at what's happening between them.
My father, I will say, he was an early fair player, and my stepmother had AFib, and she said that it was very overwhelming for her because they have 3 dogs. Uh-huh. And so I said to my father, and he said to me, I've been taking the dogs out for their morning walk. And I said to him, well, this is about 2013. What about a full dog day? What about CPE of 1 day a week? 1 day a week where Marcia knows she doesn't have to do anything with the dogs. And he's like, I don't even understand what that means. I was like, well, that's giving 2 of your dogs require medicine in the morning. That's being responsible for their 3 walks a day because they're very big dogs. That's responsible for their feeding. And so he was very overwhelmed by this idea of a full dog day. But even as that's a big pun, all dogs learn new tricks. He started moving to a full dog day. And it was very fun to hear the way they were reporting what it looked like for my father to take on. And I will say my stepmother was really nervous about it. She thought, okay, is he going to harm the dogs, not give them the medicine? But another thing out of organizational management that's really, really interesting that applies to fair play. When you give somebody ownership, their standards automatically increase. We see this in the workplace. You ask someone to come in to take notes in a meeting versus asking them to run the meeting. When you ask someone to have more ownership, their standards automatically increase. So if you don't believe me, you can look into the models that Apple has coined something called the DRI, the directly responsible individual, because they know this organizational data. Netflix, their entire company culture is around something called context, not control. The more you step away from what we gendered called nagging, I call it the RAT, the random assignment of a task. The less rats in your home, the more ownership and context, the higher the standards automatically go up. So you may not even have to have the minimum standard of care conversations. But one clarification about minimum standard of care is where I came up with that concept was actually from the law. Because what I was trying to understand is how do people adjudicate torts? How do I know if that coffee was too hot when it was spilled on that person's lap? And what I realized is we have $1 trillion tort system that's based on a concept of something called the reasonable person standard. Is this reasonable? And so that's what the minimum standard of care is. It's a reasonable person standard. When someone comes into your office and says, my partner took over the transporting of kids card, but they put a knife in the car seat. That's a true story. My husband is a chef. There was a paring knife in the car seat. That would not hold up in court under a reasonable person standard. So that's what a minimum standard of care is. It's based on the reasonable person standard that adjudicates torts.
Yes. Yes. Okay, I'm shifting into question mode. I know that we have had there's so much else on the slide decks, but I'm recognizing of our time. I know for these types of presentations, I'm always so ambitious in terms of what we can cover. And we have covered so much already about the fair play, but let's make sure we answer some of these questions before our time is up today. And I know from a therapist perspective, this one is really common. So I'd be curious to hear from you, Eve, and then I'll also add in. The question is, when you bring up the mental load concept in therapy, how do you bounce back from the male partner's defensiveness? They may feel like two women in therapy are teaming up against them.
Well, Trace, I'll ask you that first. What have you done? Because you're trained in fair play, and then I'll talk about what I've been hearing as well.
Yeah, when it comes to that defensiveness piece, I think the part that I tend to do is I put that back into the cycle, and I'm looking again at how when their partner is looking for connection, I'm going to talk this out because that's how I tend to do this. So their partner is looking for connection, their partner is looking for their partner's support. It makes sense for them to feel defensive. Can we also practice stepping outside of that defensiveness? So putting that on the side, and that acknowledging that defensiveness is around protecting ourselves. We do want to see, so again, going through that negative cycle piece, then I'm curious, what's underneath the defensiveness for this person? Are they feeling inadequate? Are they feeling like they're not doing enough? Is there a sense of shame in there that's showing up? And so when their defensiveness shows up, I would go and work with that person first and talk more about, tell me what's happening for you as we're bringing up this concept. What is this triggering for you? What thoughts and beliefs are you telling yourself? And when you get to that place, what are you feeling? What are you feeling underneath that? There is something more core and primary underneath that defensiveness that needs space to be processed in therapy. Because if you can access that core emotion where your client can then say, well, I feel like a failure. I feel like I'm never doing enough, right? Defensiveness is the outside piece. We need to go to what's underneath that. And when your client, this is similar to Emily and Matt in my book, when Matt can say, I feel like I'm never doing it right, that we want to be able to then have the other person step in there and to be able to say, that's not what I'm saying. I can see that you're feeling that way. And of course it makes sense. And actually, this is about trying to renegotiate and find a way that we can move forward together rather than playing this back and forth blame game.
Well, I think that's so beautiful, because why fair play ultimately became a love letter to men, Tracy, was that first of all, men were incredibly helpful in building the fair play system. Especially, I had a lot of beta testers who are coaches and people in the military, because people who already understand systems understand the beauty of knowing your role. So we know the term psychological safety. You may have heard that right in the workplace. Psychological safety is really a product of three things: explicitly defined expectations, fairness and transparency, and knowing your role. The third thing is where I saw a lot of defensiveness for men, which was, I don't do anything right, as Tracy said. I don't know my role in this home. That can feel as stressful as somebody who's holding the entire mental load. And so having empathy for what that might feel like to be a secondary partner or a secondary helper to somebody in the home was really, really important for me to understand. And so that's where I think if we can just create that empathy globally by saying the cards are the problem, you're not the problem.
Right.
There's this much work, and the assumptions that we've had historically, you may not be making them, but society has made them for you. So taking it out of the couple, putting it into the historical context has been really, really, really helpful. And especially talking about it in the systems terms. Because again, this idea of extreme ownership, there's a very best-selling book called Extreme Ownership from a Navy SEAL. Fair play is extreme ownership, basically. It's extreme ownership for the home.
I think we also need to, as therapists, we can take these behaviors as well. And then also when we come back to those attachment needs, I'm just thinking of some of the couples I've worked with recently, that those behaviors are a way of trying to get our attachment needs met. So that when I'm coming to you and when I'm being defensive, that defensiveness is often me saying, I'm so scared that you don't even need me here, or I'm so scared, right? There's something underneath that is a need that has to be addressed in the relationship. And again, that's where the EFT interventions of being able to heighten that emotion, being able to reflect that back to them and having them share it with their partner in a way where their partner can understand and hear it is going to be so important. And then again, the partner who is more of the pursuing of you need to, you didn't, you have to do it to this standard, then that's the person that's coming from that critical perspective, which that's their way. Again, the attachment behavior, the attachment need and longing behind that behavior is this, I need you to see me. I need you to connect with me. I need you to be on the ship, driving the ship with me, because I feel so alone up here. And I find oftentimes in couples therapy, being able to reframe this in that language can really help them before then coming into the, okay, let's keep going with the cards here. Eve, this is a question for you. How do you handle a male faking lack of competency on sharing the mental load? I frequently run into this issue in treating couples.
Yeah, we call it weaponized incompetence. Again, it often is coming from a place, as you said, Tracy, of lizard brain, of fear. So again, weaponized incompetence is, oh my God, she's going to nag me again, and so I don't want to do this, so I'm going to load the dishwasher wrong. That's going to happen if you're going to come with a random assignment of a task. In fact, we see that in the workplace too. People are less competent when you give them a rat. Again, that's my term for it, but the typical term would be either nagging or a one-off task. That's why a lot of companies, like I said, have gone to the ownership mindset, the DRI mindset. The Navy has gone to that mindset. Like I said, even my Aunt Marion's Mahjong group has gone to that mindset for bringing snack twice. So the more you can understand the ownership mindset, the less, like I said, standards increase, the less weaponized incompetence. And I think it's also important because one of the reasons for weaponized incompetence is, I think what we've seen is that men are afraid they're going to hold that card forever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if we're giving dishes to somebody, I've never done that before. Oh my God, I'm going to have to do the dishes every single day for the rest of my life. The system is incredibly flexible. It's meant for re-deals. I do not like for people to share the card. If someone's holding the conception and planning and ask you to help them go buy the balloons, you're going to come home with the wrong color balloons. That's the way we do things already. So don't share the cards because that's what everyone's doing already. They're already breaking up the conception, planning, and execution. We know that now from 10 years of research in 10 countries. But what I would encourage instead is a re-deal of the cards. So many couples are re-dealing what we call the daily grinds. The daily grinds were the cards in all of our surveys that were causing the most consternation. Lawn and plants, Tracy, surprise, are not our biggest fights. Laundry, dishes, meals, that's where our fights are coming into because they never end. These are tasks that never end. And so often what we ask is that you re-deal. 1 week on, 1 week off, one night on, one night off. You handle dinner Monday nights, I handle dinner Tuesday nights. Our minimum standard of care is to have one vegetable in any form on the table. Otherwise, I don't care as long as it's decently edible. So how you start talking in these terms, I'm holding the card today, you're holding the card next week. One big one that many couples are starting to re-deal, which I love, is the glitch in the matrix card. Many couples will say to me that it defaulted to the woman to leave their job early if a child was sick. Now people in advance of the week will say, you're holding the glitch in the matrix card. So that means if anything comes up, whether there's a leak in the faucet, a dog that throws up and has to go to the vet, a child that's sick, that is your responsibility to come home, deal with it, as opposed to mine. So this idea of re-dealing as opposed to holding the card forever or sharing is something that I think allows weaponized incompetence to sort of de-escalate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, this one I think is more for me. How do you find this works with EFT? So with emotionally focused couples therapy, so I have found myself oftentimes with couples getting stuck because the strategies and interventions within EFT are fantastic and help to build that emotional safety and to be able to meet our core attachment needs and longings. And then couples can find a solution for their problems moving forward. We know that's within stage 3. So using within EFT, what I do is I want to make sure there's emotional safety at the beginning. So a highly escalated couple, if we're going to bring in the cards at the beginning, the one or both partners will say this is one more thing on our to-do list, and then we're going to stay escalated in the negative cycle. But once couples can de-escalate and get out of the cycle, then the cards might be an option to come in, because the reality is that many couples they need to find solutions along the way as we're doing EFT. And if we can't find those solutions, we're going to keep having the same problem over and over again, which sounds like I'm telling you I need help. Underneath that, I feel like I don't matter. And we don't have a strategy or a system to address actually, how do I get you to then do the groceries card or the parents and in-laws card or whatever that is. So we do need to find that the way I work with this is that it can either come in more once stage 3, when we're in consolidation, where couples are feeling more secure, they can talk about their attachment needs and longings, they can see those previous cycles, they get out of it. Or I'm using it more within stage 2, once couples have been able to de-escalate out of it. There was one more question in here, Eve. How do you encourage a conversation about the minimal standard of care when one partner has unrealistically high expectations, but does assume full responsibility for that expectation?
Well, often what we've seen is that those unrealistic expectations are not actually that unrealistic. So we will, it depends, right? This idea of your standards are too high is actually a pretty condescending and anti-feminist message that we've heard as women for so long, right? Most people who have dealt with the mental load before this have had some version of lowering your standards as one of the solutions. So again, I don't look at high standards or low standards. I look at what does a reasonable person do? And again, that's where therapists come in. They can really help with these minimum standard of care conversations by helping couples tell their story. Often it's somebody saying, I care more than they do, so I will take it on. But again, why that feels so bad is because that's similar to saying, well, their job is stressful. I don't care about it. I should care about what my partner cares about. Of course, there's going to be people with unreasonable expectations, but typically that's not what I see at all. What I see is people who want real expectations. They want their shoes to go back in a place that feels proper so that their chaos in their head isn't made worse. They want a vegetable with a meal. They want their kids to be fed breakfast before they go to school. So I'm actually not seeing such high standards out there in the world. I see people who have gotten so fed up, so they're doing it themselves, and the society around them obviously forcing them into certain non-essential tasks that they can deal with when they go through the deck and decide and return to their values. But I'd love to hear from you, Tracy, what you think about how do you navigate those minimum standard of care conversations?
I think this is an important one around asking what do others around you experience? What are others' desires and wishes? Not that we need to compare ourselves, but again, finding what is reasonable within a relationship. So if it's that's one piece, but then Eve, you're already saying this is like, what is the significance of this? What's underneath that? So you've already given the garbage example from your own experience with you and Seth. But again, I think of the couple that says the water glass is always put right beside the dishwasher. It's never put in the dishwasher. What is the significance of that for you? What does it remind you of? And again, for therapists, that's where those emotionally focused strategies can help you to break that open for clients, to really tap into those core emotions underneath that their partner needs to be able to understand that and to see what those needs and longings are, so that then you can get onto the same page and find that minimum standard of care. Eve, I love that you've added there the piece around society, how it tells us that women especially have these high and unrealistic expectations. And that we've grown up with these messages throughout our lives. So I appreciate that. There are so many questions. We could go on for a long time. I did not get to all of my slides because we've just had such a great conversation. I'm so grateful that we've been able to do this together. If you're looking for more information, all of our details are here. And Eve, I'm so grateful that we had this chance to sit together.
Same, Tracy. I know this is just the beginning. This is a 101. There's a lot of concepts here. But as one wonderful man said to me, he is willing to forgo all the sociological status and women's rage in the beginning because the system was very helpful for them. So these are free resources. You can find them all on fairplaylife.com to use the cards. You can reach out to Tracy, but we want to let you know these are all free resources. We want you to start using them so that we can all start to take off this mental load that is falling 2/3 or more on women in 17 different countries that we went to.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.